I began helping with the church's garden a few months ago to earn some extra money and find a bit of peace. It was a quiet place, surrounded by tall hedges and rows of flowers that changed with the season. At dusk, the setting sun often cast a warm glow over the gravestones tucked behind the old chapel. Many families from the nearby town buried loved ones in that small cemetery, marking each plot with a neat headstone engraved with names and dates. Spending my afternoons there, I felt calm trimming the hedges, watering the beds of marigolds, and tidying the paths so visitors could pass through easily. One evening, as I was loading up my tools and preparing to leave, I noticed a corner of the cemetery that never seemed to get much attention. It sat right behind the far wall of the church, where ivy covered the bricks. The grass was a bit overgrown there, and the evening light seemed to fade more quickly near that spot. Curious, I walked over, stepping through the tall grass, careful not to trip over the small stones propped at odd angles in the soil. That was when I found it, a simple, weathered gravestone with no name at all. It was barely knee-high, slightly tilted, and covered in moss. No date, no family name, nothing. It looked older than all the others, as if nobody had cared for it in many years. I knelt down and brushed away the moss, hoping to find some hidden letters. The stone felt cold, even in the warmth of twilight, but no words revealed themselves. I stayed there for a few minutes, wondering about the person buried beneath. Why would it be left unmarked, when all the other graves had neat inscriptions and flowers around them? Maybe the name had worn away over time, or maybe it was never carved in the first place. It made me feel strangely sad. Eventually, the light grew too dim to see clearly, and I realized it was time to lock up the gardening shed. I decided I would tidy that corner, soon trim the grass, clear the stone, make it less lonely. That very night, I slept poorly. My dreams were full of distant weeping, a muffled cry that echoed through a shadowy garden. More than once, I woke up in a cold sweat. I told myself it was only because I'd stayed so late at the cemetery. Sometimes, lonely thoughts creep into your head when the night is quiet. I pushed the dream aside and went about my day. The next evening, I finished my usual tasks earlier, then returned to that unmarked stone. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything with a soft orange light. I carefully trimmed the grass around it, pulled up a few stubborn weeds, and even placed a small bunch of wildflowers nearby. No one had claimed this grave for years, but that did not mean it had to look forgotten. While I worked, I felt a cool breeze against my neck, though there was hardly any wind elsewhere. It passed quickly, leaving a faint chill in my bones. I shrugged it off and reminded myself that old churchyards can give off odd feelings, especially at dusk. The mind plays tricks, noticing every small shift in light or temperature. By the time I closed up the shed, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and the sky was turning deep blue. Walking through the rows of gravestones on my way out, I could not resist one last glance at the little marker behind the church. Even in the gathering darkness, the unmarked stone seemed to stand out. The corner felt quieter than the rest of the garden, as if the night air hovered there more heavily. I paused, gripping the keys in my hand. Then I heard it, a soft sound, like someone crying far away. It was a gentle sob, barely audible, but it tugged at my heart. I spun around, trying to see if anyone was there, but all I saw was the dim outline of headstones and the tall hedge bordering the property. I stood still, listening. The sobbing faded into the night. Fear mingled with sorrow inside me. Was someone hiding behind the church? I walked quickly around the perimeter, shining my phone's weak flashlight under the hedges. Nobody was there. At last, I convinced myself it had to be my imagination or maybe the distant call of a night bird. Still, as I locked the gate behind me, my mind replayed that sound over and over. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on regular chores. The church employees appreciated my work in the garden, so I concentrated on making every flower bed look neat. But I couldn't stop thinking about the unmarked grave. One afternoon, I asked the parish priest if he remembered who was buried behind the church. He frowned, trying to recall. "That corner is quite old," he said in a gentle voice. "The records aren't always clear. I believe it might be a grave from decades back, perhaps a traveler who had no family. I'm not certain." That short answer left me unsatisfied. I wanted to know more why the stone had no name, whether someone used to bring flowers. But the priest had no further information. He suggested I check the older registers in the small archive room if I wished, though they were disorganized. I thanked him and planned to look one day when I had more time. Night fell again. With a flashlight in hand, I stayed a bit later than usual, hoping to prove to myself that there was nothing strange behind the church. I wandered among the gravestones, pausing by each one, reading names and dates to distract my jittery thoughts. When I reached the unmarked stone, I set down my flashlight, determined to see if the ground near the base showed any sign of an inscription. I had a small trowel and gently scraped the moss away from the lower edge. Nothing emerged but more blank surface. I sighed, a wave of sadness washing over me. I whispered, "I don't know who you are, but I hope you're at peace." My own voice sounded too loud in the quiet cemetery. Picking up the flashlight, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop. My arms broke out in goosebumps. Then I heard the sobbing again, soft and close. It resonated like someone was right behind me. The hair on my neck stood straight. Slowly I turned. Only darkness. The nearest gravestones glowed faintly in my flashlight beam, their words unclear. Yet the sobbing continued, as though drifting on the wind, a muffled cry full of sorrow. My heart pounded, but I willed myself to speak. "Hello? Are you all right?" As soon as I said the words, the weeping ceased. I stood in tense silence, listening to my own rapid breathing. Nobody answered. A surge of pity and fear raced through me. Part of me wanted to run straight out of there, never looking back. Another part felt a strange empathy for whoever or whatever made that sad sound. Was it a restless spirit longing for someone to know their story? Or was it just the wind catching in the old stone walls, creating an echo? I decided to leave at once, so I hurried across the rows and let myself out through the garden gate. Even on the walk home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure following me. The streetlights felt almost too bright after the darkness of the cemetery. That night, I struggled to sleep, replaying the faint cries in my head. I told myself that I must do something to help, though I had no idea how. The next day, after I finished the day's gardening chores, I went into the church's archive room. Dust covered thick ledgers, old documents, and fading photographs. I spent hours flipping through them, scanning for any mention of an unmarked grave. My head ached from the cramped handwriting. Finally, in a small ledger from decades ago, I found a brief entry that might fit. Burial of unknown child, found near the road, no family claimed. There was a single date from many years back, but no name, no details. Just a sorrowful note, a child with no known relatives. My eyes burned with unexpected tears. A child laid to rest behind the church, all alone. No wonder there was no name on the stone. The shock of it weighed on my heart. Knowing this, I returned to the grave at dusk one final time. I wrote a simple note on a small piece of paper. "You are not forgotten." I placed it next to fresh flowers and whispered a short prayer. Standing there, I felt the evening breeze flutter my hair, and a profound silence wrapped around me. After a moment, I thought I heard a soft sigh, less like a sob and more like relief. My eyes welled up, but this time I was not afraid. I closed them, imagining a young spirit, once lost, finally sensing a bit of comfort. From that day on, I never again heard sobbing at night. The unseen sadness behind the church seemed to fade. I still tend the garden, and each time I walk by that small unmarked stone, I leave a flower or a quiet thought of kindness. Though we may never know the child's name or story, I believe that small act of remembering can bring peace. And so, beneath the tall hedges and flickering dusk light, the lost grave rests a little easier, no longer alone in the shadows.